The shocking case of the grandmother who made her grandchildren her husbands in a remote hut since 1966. No neighbor wanted to approach. From a distance, the hut was barely a speck among the twisted trees of the dry hill, but those who had dared to look closer spoke of odors difficult to describe, of sepulchral silence, and of human figures that sometimes moved like shadows. A rumor began to circulate in the nearby villages that an old woman lived with her husband's sons, and that none of them had been seen on a road, in a shop, or in a school for over 40 years. What was found inside in 2004 was much worse than anyone could have imagined. I am Burgo, and this is Mexico Prohibido. If you are interested in stories that no one wants to tell, buried out of fear or shame, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because what you are about to hear today is not just a tragedy. It is a broken mirror of what a community refused to see. Let's begin. It all started in 1966, in a forgotten village in the mountains of Chiapas. Candelaria Gomez, a 38-year-old woman, lost her husband and 2 of her 3 children in a landslide caused by torrential rains. While her husband's body still lay buried under the mud, she was left alone with her youngest daughter, Felipa, who was only 10 years old. The loss broke something more than just her soul. From then on, she began to speak aloud to the dead, read biblical passages backward, and say that God had assigned her a new mission. The neighbors, fearful and superstitious, began to avoid her. She herself then erected an improvised fence of rotten wood and rusty wire. She said no one else should enter. The world was contaminated, and there, on her property, the pure ones remained. No one pushed. In the village, if someone becomes strange, they are left alone. That is the custom. Years passed, and Felipa no longer went to school. Some said they had seen her washing clothes by the river, always with her head bowed, and that she had marks on her arms. Others murmured that she was pregnant. One day, she disappeared. No one saw her again. Candelaria said she had gone with an angel and left her a gift from heaven. This gift was a baby, which she herself introduced as her new son. She carried him wrapped in old blankets, nursed him with improvised formulas, and spoke to him as if he were her husband. She named him Isaias, but he was not to be the only one. Over time, more children were born in the hut. Always with a particular characteristic: eyes that did not look straight, heads that were larger than normal, skin with purple spots. All were boys. All were, she said, sons of God. None were registered. None were vaccinated. None ever left the fence. Candelaria raised them as husbands. She assigned each one a role. One accompanied her to sleep, another prepared her food, and another was to pray naked with her at midnight, while she dictated prayers mixed with incomprehensible phrases. She told them that outside was sin, that women were a trap of the devil, and that they were her living church. The children grew up without full names, without mirrors, without any language other than the one she taught them. They ate boiled rice, roots, and pieces of dried meat that she kept in rusty jars. They slept on mats covered with burlap. They knew no electricity. One of them died when he swallowed a nail while playing. Candelaria buried him in the backyard and said he had been taken by the light. In the 90s, a group of evangelical clergy came to the area and tried to evangelize the surrounding houses. Someone told them about the Witch of the Hill, and one of the pastors tried to enter. Candelaria received him with a friendly smile, let him in, and no one saw him again. The community assumed he had left. No one investigated, but in 2003, something changed. An indigenous nurse named Hermelinda, dispatched by a rural health program, noticed that a property in her register was marked as a family residence, but had no contact for decades. She decided to walk to the area. It took 5 hours. When she arrived, she saw smoke rising from the improvised chimney and heard a voice singing psalms. She knocked on the door. No one opened, but she saw through a crack huge eyes staring at her from the darkness. She returned to the health center and wrote a report. No one took her seriously. She persisted. She traveled to the state capital, spoke with her superiors, showed her diary. Finally, a prosecutor authorized an official visit. It was scheduled for February 2004, and they were prepared to see an abandoned house. What they found was an active hut, frozen in time. There were worm-eaten wooden chairs, glass bottles filled with opaque liquids, a cross hung upside down, and in the middle, a 76-year-old woman with glassy eyes and a bent back, surrounded by 3 adult men with awkward bodies, deformed faces, and empty stares. One of them said he was 13 years old. Another assured that the lady was his wife. The third did not speak. Candelaria embraced them individually and said, "They are my blood, my saints, my lambs. They know no evil." The police did not know how to react. The prosecutor ordered a search of the property. Bone remains were found in a metal box, drawings with religious figures, and sentences written on the walls with charcoal. The flesh belongs to her. Love needs no papers. What is born of pure love cannot be sin. Candelaria was arrested without resistance. On the way to the prosecutor's office, she prayed softly, calling the officers fallen brothers. She never denied anything. She said she had been chosen to preserve the purity of the lineage, that her grandchildren were fruits of love without contamination, that there was no family outside, only chaos. The 3 men were taken to a hospital. They showed severe malnutrition, multiple skin infections, partial vision loss, and profound cognitive impairments. They could not count. They did not understand the concept of day and night. One of them had 49.8% the same DNA as Candelaria. What happened next shocked the entire country. The medical report, published 10 days after the rescue of the 3 men from the hut, sent shivers down the spines, even of the most experienced specialists. The diagnosis was not limited to the physical. It spoke of entire lives shaped in silence, of minds formed under a system of absolute control, of adult bodies that had never known free will. The authorities tried to define them as victims of prolonged abuse, but the words were insufficient in the face of what they had experienced. They were named Isaias, Reuben, and Joel. They were not their real names, as they legally had none. They were identified only by physical characteristics and the way they clung to the words of the woman who had raised them. All showed similar characteristics: hunched shoulders, an empty gaze, fear of human contact, and an alarming emotional dependence. They slept in a fetal position, trembled at loud noises, and rejected food that was not white rice or clear soup, as this was the only thing they knew. The first weeks were chaotic. The medical team at the General Hospital of Tuxtla Gutierrez had to improvise a comprehensive treatment protocol. It was not only necessary to stabilize them physically, but also to teach them the most basic things, from washing their hands to using a toilet. One of them urinated in the corner of the room and then tried to cover the puddle with his own clothes. as if that had been his routine his whole life. Another spent hours singing the same invented melody, which the doctors would later identify as a prayer composed by Candelaria. The genetic results confirmed what was already suspected. The three were direct grandchildren of Candelaria, but also shared the same maternal genetic line. The inbreeding was extreme. One of them had a chromosome duplication that explained his neurological difficulties. Forensic geneticists explained that it was one of the longest documented cases of endogamy in Mexico. They were not only children of an incestuous relationship, they were the result of a chain of mother-son unions that had been maintained for decades. Meanwhile, Candelaria was incarcerated in a women's correctional facility in Chiapas. At first, many inmates feared her. Her appearance, her glassy eyes, her slow way of speaking, and that tone, both maternal and prophetic, made her a difficult figure to understand. But soon, some began to approach. She spoke to them about the purity of the lineage and the chosen ones from the mountain. She said she had been sent by God to care for those the world threw away. That her grandchildren were like lambs who never knew evil because they never touched the outside world. When reporters gained access to the court records, they found entire pages of convoluted reports, prayers mixed with household instructions, and childlike drawings made with pencil on pages torn from a Bible. In one of them, a radiant female figure was depicted, surrounded by children with wings and black eyes. Below it, in shaky handwriting, was the sentence, "They are my flesh, but they are not sin." Candelaria's defense argued that she suffered from chronic, untreated psychosis, with possible trauma-induced schizophrenic episodes. The prosecution did not hesitate to respond that this did not excuse the crimes committed: severe sexual abuse, unlawful detention, failure to provide assistance, and negligent homicide due to medical omission. However, the legal case evaporated over time. Candelaria fell ill. She refused to eat. She said she was fasting spiritually. She lost her sight, then her mobility. Finally, she died on June 8, 2005, in a hospital prison cell, just 1 year after her arrest. She was 77 years old. The news of her death divided public opinion. Some saw her as a monster, others as a mentally ill victim of neglect. Social networks, which were already gaining prominence, filled with comments ranging from outrage to sensationalism. How was it possible that something like this had happened in the middle of the 21st century? How could no one have noticed it before? How could the community remain silent for almost 5 decades? It was Hermelinda, the nurse who reported the case, who broke the silence in an interview on local radio. She said that when she first knocked on that door, she felt a shiver that paralyzed her body, that she heard a male voice praying like a child, that what pained her most was seeing through a crack a young face that seemed to be seeking help but did not know how to ask for it. She ended the interview with a sentence that echoed throughout the country. It was not a hidden tragedy. It was an ignored tragedy. After Candelaria's death, the case seemed to dissolve. The 3 men were transferred to a specialized center for adults with severe disabilities. A team of therapists worked for years on their rehabilitation. Small progress was made. One began to draw, another to write his name. The third never regained speech but responded with a slight smile when he heard music. One day, a psychologist asked Isaias, the eldest of the 3, what he remembered from his childhood. He took a piece of paper and drew a house without windows, a large bed in the middle, and 4 figures, a woman in a long dress and 3 children around her. Then he wrote a single word at the top: family. There was no public trial, no compensation, no closure. The authorities never investigated whether there were other children. The bones found were never identified. The hut was closed by order of the community and then demolished, as if that could undo what had happened. In its place is now an overgrown wasteland with a rusty cross in the middle. But there are those who have not forgotten. Every year on the anniversary of the rescue, Hermelinda returns to that place with a burning candle. She sits silently, prays a rosary, and places a white flower on the ground. When asked why she does it, she replies, "Because if the world knew what I saw, no one would sleep peacefully." For a time, the case of Candelaria Gomez and her grandchildren seemed to dissolve into the fog of court records, like so many other files that the Mexican system buries under the weight of its own bureaucracy. But among those directly involved, the story never faded, not because it was unforgettable, but because it left wounds that still festered. At the specialized care center where the three men were housed, progress was slow and painful. Isaias, Ruben, and Joel suffered not only from the physical consequences of prolonged confinement, muscle atrophy, broken teeth, bone deformities, chronic infections, but also from a profound psychological fragmentation. They behaved like small children in adult bodies. Most external stimuli overwhelmed them. The light of fluorescent lamps, the sound of a car, the hot water of a shower. They did not speak of the grandmother. They did not ask about her. But every time someone spoke her name aloud, their expression changed. Their eyes clouded over, their shoulders tensed. Some mumbled disjointed sentences that psychiatrists could not decipher. One of them once wrote with a trembling hand on the wall of the center's bathroom stall, "Mama watches us from the smoke." No one knew exactly what he was referring to, but the caregivers decided to cover that sentence with white paint. The center's director said they should not be further traumatized. It was Hermelinda who broke the silence again. After years of distance, she decided to gather everything she remembered. She wrote it by hand, in a red school notebook, in clear, unadorned script. She called it Chronicle of a Silence. She did not want to publish it. She did it, as she said, so as not to take everything to her grave. In its pages, she spoke not only of the hut, of the men, and of Candelaria, but of the collective fear that covered the village like a thick fog for decades. She wrote that many had heard cries at dawn, that some had even seen the children when they were small, running naked behind the house, that there were murmurs in the church, in the shop, at wakes, but no one acted, out of fear, out of habit, or out of indifference. And she added a line that was later quoted in a university study: "Evil does not always scream. Sometimes it kneels, prays, bakes tortillas, and sings lullabies." When this notebook reached the hands of a journalist named Andrea Lujan from an independent digital newspaper, she decided to turn this story into a deeper investigation. Together with a small team, she traveled to San Pedro de los Cedros, the village closest to the old hut. She was not well received. Some denied knowing what she was talking about. Others looked at her scornfully. But an elderly woman, an herbalist, agreed to speak with her off camera. She said that Candelaria had always been strange but never aggressive, that she had a fixed gaze, as if she saw things others could not, that after losing her husband, she completely withdrew, and no one ever saw her smile again, that she occasionally appeared in the square to buy salt and candles, but then stopped going out. And that one night, many years ago, A child was seen knocking at the church door, covered in mud and with a bleeding mouth. By the time they tried to help him, he had already disappeared. The journalist included these testimonies in a report titled, "The House That Never Existed," accompanied by photos of the abandoned property where the hut once stood. The article was shared thousands of times on social media. There was outrage, rejection, but also an avalanche of conspiracy theories, rumors, and morbid comments. Some said it was a lie, others that Candelaria's children were the product of a pact with the devil. There were even those who claimed to see her spirit wandering in the bush, wrapped in a white cloth. What no one knew was that the state never officially recognized Isaias, Reuben, and Joel as victims. No institutional apology was issued. Beyond the original protocol, no permanent psychological support was offered. They lived thanks to private donations and the silent work of volunteers like Hermelinda and some doctors at the center. Their existence was not listed in any public register. They were, legally, non-persons. They were, literally, ghosts of the system. In 2009, one of them passed away. It was Reuben. He had severe respiratory problems since childhood, exacerbated by confinement, and a poorly treated pneumonia ended his life within a few days. He died in a simple bed, held by a nurse who spoke into his ear. His last words were unintelligible, but according to the nurse, he mumbled something that sounded like, "I can go out now." The wake was intimate. Only 4 people attended, 2 therapists, Hermelinda and his brother Joel. Isaias could not go. He was in a deep emotional outburst and was sedated to prevent self-harm. The coffin was white, without ornaments. The tombstone only had a name, Reuben. There was no last name, no exact date of birth. The priest who read the Mass said it bluntly, "Today we bury a son of God who did not know the world, but whom the world knew too late." After this loss, silence enveloped everything again. Andrea Lujan, the journalist, tried to reopen the court case. She sought lawyers, pressured local authorities, wrote columns, gave interviews, but no one wanted to take the case. The prosecutors considered it closed. The evidence had been destroyed. The hut had been demolished without securing evidence. The bone remains found were never sent to a forensic laboratory, and Candelaria was no longer alive to be prosecuted. All that remained were 3 men, now 2, with broken eyes and a heart trapped in a childhood that was never real. Hermelinda continued to visit them. She brought them sweet bread, drawings, picture books. She spoke to them lovingly. Sometimes Isaias asked her to tell him stories of things he had never experienced, what a school looks like, what it feels like to ride a bus, what applause sounds like. Joel, for his part, wrote disordered sentences in an old notebook. One of them read, "The day does not enter when the door is closed." Neither asked about his mother or grandmother, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, the caregivers heard them praying, and in their prayers they continued to repeat her name, as if, despite everything, they were still searching for her voice. Because when a life begins in captivity, freedom hurts more than the bars. In late 2011, the case discreetly resurfaced in specialized mental health forums and at a Congress on Structural Violence in Latin America. An Argentine doctor, who read Andrea Lujan's report, presented Isaias's clinical case as an extreme example of the syndrome of prolonged domestic institutionalization, an unusual term that describes people cut off from contact with the outside world in a family environment. No one was surprised that Mexico provided the most brutal example. But outside academic circles, the case had again fallen into oblivion. The few who remembered it spoke of it in vague terms. The witch of Chiapas, the children who were grandchildren, the deformed ones from the mountain. Sensationalism had replaced compassion, forgetfulness, indignation. Isaias now lived in a single room at the center. Joel, his only surviving brother, had been transferred to a specialized nursing home in Tabasco after a severe crisis that left him with partial paralysis. Since then, they had had no contact, not by their own choice but due to a lack of staff who could transport them. Both depended on what the state system decided month by month with its budget. It was Hermelinda who again refused to give up. She had spent years collecting testimonies, searching for distant relatives, and reconstructing Candelaria's family tree. She managed to contact a niece of Felipa, the disappeared daughter, who now lived in the north of the country. The woman, initially reserved, finally agreed to speak. She said that her mother had fled the house at 14 after becoming pregnant after an abuse she never dared to name. She traveled alone to Monterrey and gave birth to a baby in a public hospital. The baby died a few days later. She never returned to Chiapas. She never spoke to anyone about what she had experienced. Hermelinda showed her photos of the grandchildren. The woman looked at them silently, her face rigid, and only said, "They have the same eyes as my mother." She did not want to get further involved. She asked not to be contacted again. She cried before hanging up the phone. With this last severed thread, Hermelinda decided to write an open letter. She sent it to media outlets, universities, congressmen, churches, and digital platforms. It read, "This is not the case of a sick woman. This is the case of a country sick with indifference. Because she raised them in darkness? Yes. But we allowed the darkness to last half a century. Every year without a report, every canceled visit, every look the other way, that hurt us too." The letter was published in some independent media, but did not have a massive impact. However, it reached the hands of a young human rights lawyer named Matias Cordoba. He was 29 years old, a graduate of UNAM, and worked for an organization dedicated to combating domestic violence in rural communities. Matias traveled to the center where Isaias lived. He found him sitting in the inner garden, staring at a bird hopping on the edge of a waterless well. He asked permission to speak with him. Isaias did not answer, but he listened. When Matias showed him a photo of his brother Joel, Isaias smiled. It was the first time in years that anyone had seen him smile clearly. Then he took the photo and placed it against his chest. He said nothing, but his eyes became moist. Matias decided to take on his case. Not for legal purposes, because there was nothing left to condemn, but to demand that the state recognize him as a citizen, as a victim, and as a human being with rights. He initiated a procedure to obtain his CURP, his birth certificate, and a legal document that would allow him access to health services, special education, and therapeutic support. It was a procedure full of obstacles. He had no documents. There was no birth certificate. There were no living witnesses to his childhood. It was necessary to present DNA studies, medical reports, letters signed by Hermelinda and other witnesses, and finally, an expert report on human identity based on genetic similarity with remains from the forensic archive. The process lasted almost a year. But one day, In the small civil registry office, they handed him the first official document with his name. Isaias Gomez Ortega, born on March 3rd, 1973. He was called forward. He walked slowly, dressed in the same shirt he had worn for weeks. He took the paper with both hands and looked at it for minutes. He did not fully understand what it meant. But he knew that for the first time, he had something that identified him as part of the world. He stroked it with his fingers. Then he looked up and asked softly, "Am I someone now?" Matthias organized a small symbolic ceremony at the center. They bought him a cake. Hermelinda brought flowers. The therapists applauded. Isaias cried silently. When asked what he wanted to do now that he had documents, he replied, "I want to see Joel. I want to tell him we're alive." The reunion took place weeks later. Joel, thinner and with an extinguished face, arrived in a wheelchair. When he saw Isaias, his body tensed, as if he didn't know whether to rejoice or fear. Isaias knelt before him, took his hand, and said, "It's us. We're still here." No one spoke in the following minutes. Only the wind and the distant crowing of a rooster could be heard. Then Joel painfully raised his other hand and placed it on his brother's head. That was his way of responding. Since that day, Matthias initiated a formal request for the Mexican state to issue a public apology for omission, negligence, and institutional neglect in this case. The National Human Rights Commission agreed to review the file. There were meetings, interviews, press conferences, but meanwhile, life went on. Isaias began to write. He could not do it fluently, but he copied letters and tried to form sentences. In an old notebook, he described what he called his story. They were loose sentences. I was born without a door. Mama sang at night. The children had no name. On the last page, he wrote something that brought tears to Matthias's eyes. I did not understand why the sun rose if we could not see it. Now I know it was not the sun's fault. This notebook became part of the organization's archive. No one wanted to edit it. They decided it should remain as it was, with its disarray, with its silences, with its truth, because there are stories that are not told to be understood. They are told so that they do not repeat themselves. In recent years, Isaias and Joel lived more as brothers than as survivors. Although they could never fully understand the rules of society or adapt to the speed of the modern world, they began to build something akin to peace. Hermelinda continued to visit them until her retirement. Every week she brought them sweet bread, a new notebook, or a rosary. They called her Good Woman and smiled tenderly at her, as if she were the only safe reference point in a life marked by confusion and darkness. One October day, Isaias asked to see a church. He had never been in one. He only remembered the crooked wooden crucifix hanging in the hut, where his grandmother mumbled prayers that mixed Catholic prayers with phrases that seemed inhuman. Matthias organized a careful visit. He chose a small parish with a priest who knew the story and was willing to receive them without questions. When Isaias stepped through the door, he stopped. He walked slowly through the central aisle, observing the stained glass windows, the empty pews, the warm light falling from the altar. Then he knelt, without anyone asking him to. He closed his eyes. He said nothing. But when he opened his lips, he mumbled, "If you were there all this time, why did you wait so long?" It was the first time he questioned God, and perhaps also the first time he allowed himself to believe that he had not been entirely alone. The brothers' story began to be known outside institutional circles when a young Mexican documentary filmmaker, Mariana Ribas, decided to turn their story into a short film. She traveled to the center, interviewed Matias, Hermelinda, and the few workers who still remembered the case. Isaias did not speak on camera, but he allowed his hands while writing, his gaze at the plants in the garden, and his long silence before falling asleep every afternoon to be filmed. The documentary was called The Children of Captivity and was shown at a local festival. It did not win any awards, but one scene deeply moved the few who saw it. A moment where Isaias drew a door and at the end wrote beneath it, "I don't want to open it. I just want to know that it exists." This sentence stuck to the walls of the center where he still lived. Over time, some workers adopted it as a motto for other cases of domestic confinement, abuse, or neglect. In 2023, Matias succeeded in having the state government grant the two brothers symbolic compensation. It was not enough money to change their lives, but it allowed for constant medical care, high-quality food, and the possibility of having their own space. They moved into a small house on the same grounds as the center, a small white house with flowers at the entrance and two wooden chairs under an awning. There they lived quietly, far from noise but also far from captivity. Joel passed away in January 2024 in his sleep. Isaias found him upon waking. He did not scream. He did not cry. He sat beside his bed and held his hand for hours. When the center's staff came, he asked them not to remove the shared photo from the wall. Only that. Then he locked himself in his room for 3 days. On the 4th day, he came out. He went into the garden. He sat in front of the tree that provided the most shade. And there he began to write again. He did it not for fame, nor for justice. He did it because he had understood that his story, as painful as it was also a warning, a question, an open wound in the conscience of a country. Because this hut, which had been isolated since 1966, was not only in the jungle. It was in every corner where silence weighs more than truth, where the cries of children do not reach the authorities, where a sick grandmother can build a shadow world while society looks away. And although Isaias never sought revenge or wanted to expose anyone, his life became a testimony. He did not speak much, but when asked what he would tell other children suffering in captivity today, he replied with a single sentence, "Do not believe that no one sees you. Sometimes God takes time, but he comes." Today he continues to write, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with surprising clarity. He has a blue notebook in which he draws doors, crosses, and a female figure with long braids that reappears constantly. No one knows if it is his mother, Hermelinda, or someone who exists only in his memory. The fact is, Isaias exists. He has a name. He has a story. And although for years he was a prisoner of silence, his voice now walks slowly, but it walks. And if you have come this far, dear viewer, I want to ask you something. This story was not told to provoke sensationalism. It was told to remind us that there are still hidden wounds in the mountains, in the villages, in the families, in the memories of the forgotten. If you believe that no one should experience what Isaias experienced, subscribe to this channel, share this video, and leave a comment. Tell me what you felt, what you think, or simply leave a prayer for those who are still waiting to be seen. I am Burgo, And this is Mexico Prohibido. Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next story.